I don't know how I've lived as long as I have. My lifestyle has been anything but wholesome, and most of my existence could be described as chaotic and violent. All of my family died young, and, with one exception, I didn't miss them. I can tell you about my tough upbringing and my difficult life, and it would be true, up to a point. My family and peers, they were a screwed-up bunch. This will become evident as I tell my story. Still, if I'm being honest, I'd have to admit that I'm the worst of the lot. I've been selfish, greedy, violent, and deeply sinful. But for some reason, I was given a second chance. My memories of that fateful night are rather hazy. Inevitably, there was a wild party which involved a lot of booze and drugs. I awoke in a strange place, surrounded by the sleeping bodies of people I didn't know. This wasn't a unique situation for me, but still, something felt off. My head was pounding, and I had a foul taste in my mouth, but nevertheless, I pulled myself up and explored my surroundings. I was surprised to find myself in a rather plush penthouse apartment, not the type of establishment I was used to waking in after a weekend-long bender. Perhaps I was moving up in the world. I staggered over to the window and looked down upon the darkened city below, soon realizing something wasn't right. When I say the city was shrouded in darkness, I mean literally so. I couldn't see a single electric light anywhere on the horizon, as the only illumination came from the pale light of the moon and faint glow of far-distant stars. I guessed it could have been a citywide blackout, but I also couldn't see any cars or headlights on the streets. It was freaky, but I didn't think too much about it. Clearly, this party was at an end, and so my priority was getting the hell out of here. With some difficulty, I stepped over the snoring party guests and eventually found my way to the door, and then the corridor beyond. At first glance, there was nothing special about the elevator, which would soon become crucial to my story and change my life forever. It was just a normal elevator with sliding steel doors and a button lit up to summon the lift. I was on the top floor, so there was only one way to go: down. I hesitated before reaching out to push the button, feeling a cold chill running through me that I couldn't explain. But nevertheless, I summoned the elevator, experiencing a surge of static electricity as my finger made contact. I was surprised to hear the mechanical ping just a few seconds later as the door swung open. I was even more startled to see the enigmatic and somewhat scary figure standing inside, his finger poised on the button. And to say that this character was strange would be an understatement. He was an elderly man, white-haired and wrinkled, but surprisingly sturdy-looking. I noted how he was dressed up to the nines, wearing a full three-piece suit, waistcoat, bow tie, and top hat. The only thing missing was a monocle. I almost laughed out loud at the old man's almost comical appearance, but something held me back. I think it was the look in his eyes, which marked him out as a serious and perhaps dangerous individual.
"Good evening, sir,"
he said, addressing me in a deep, raspy voice.
"Going down, I take it."
Yeah, I answered in confusion. "And who the hell are you, the elevator attendant?" My tone was ruder than the situation called for, but the man didn't seem to take offense.
"In a manner of speaking, sir, I will be your guide and traveling companion through the journey to come. I look forward to our time together, but must warn you that our adventure will be long and arduous."
What the hell are you talking about? I demanded. My head was pounding, and I had no patience for these riddles. I just wanted to get out of this place. Again, the attendant, or whoever the hell he was, didn't react to my insult.
Please, sir. Time is marching on, and we really should be making moves. I'm sure you don't want to stay here any longer than necessary.
I didn't. But at the same time, I certainly wasn't keen to get into a lift with this weirdo. I wondered whether there was another way out. Perhaps a staircase or maintenance lift? But when I turned my head and looked back, I was shocked to see a scene of utter carnage. The corridor walls were literally dripping with a dark crimson liquid, which I feared was blood, and the penthouse suite I'd just left had been transformed into a fiery inferno, the room now engulfed by flames, and the sleeping guests burning, their skin and flesh melting under the intense heat. I told myself it must be a hallucination, but I could feel the flames burning my skin and the smell, the foul stench from the horrific human barbecue. Jesus H. Christ, what the hell happened?
We really should be going, sir,
the attendant repeated, with a degree of urgency now evident in his voice. Are you crazy? We can't use the lift during a fire. We'll be burnt alive.
There is no way out, sir. You will need to trust me.
The fire was growing more intense, and the smoke was filling up my lungs. I coughed and spluttered as my panicked brain tried to think. I was sure I would die if I stayed here, and really didn't have any other options. And so I darted for the elevator door, jumping inside, just before the operator pushed the button to close the door, sealing the smoke and fire on the far side.
A wise choice, sir,
said the attendant, with a sly smile on his crusty lips.
And now, we may begin.
I shuddered when I looked into his dark, emotionless eyes, and wondered what this lunatic had in store for me. As it happened, the enigmatic elevator attendant was about to introduce me to a hell I could never have imagined in my worst nightmares. Once I regained my senses and cleared my lungs, I soon realized there was something else wrong with this compact elevator. There were no floor numbers displayed on the control panel, and, in fact, I could only see one button, and this had no number. Nevertheless, the lift was descending at a considerable rate, although the trip seemed to last an eternity. Isn't there an emergency phone in here? We need to call the fire brigade. The attendant didn't answer, instead staring straight forward. I had a sudden urge to grab the old man by his shoulders and shake him vigorously, but I didn't think this would be a good idea. Are you listening to me, man? I demanded, whilst struggling to control my anxiety. We're in danger here.
No harm will come to you whilst we are inside of this vessel. The dangers on the other side will become self-evident. But you should only worry about what lies ahead, and not what we've left behind.
What the hell? I mouthed, as I tried to make some sense of these cryptic words. Instead, I decided to ignore his bizarre ramblings and the many red flags. Whatever, man. I just want to get the hell out of here and go home.
Yes, you're home,
the attendant answered thoughtfully.
I will do my best to see you safely return to your own world. But there are limits to my powers as a guide. You will need to face your own demons and fight for survival. I must warn you, sir, your journey shall not be an easy one.
I shook my head in dismay and no longer tried to make sense of this guy's bullshit. Clearly, he was either batshit crazy or was deliberately messing with me. In any case, I wanted to get out of the elevator and far away from this nut job. Therefore, I was very much relieved to hear the ping as the lift came to a sudden stop.
Level 1,
the attendant explained, without elaborating. You mean the ground floor? I asked frantically. We can get out of here.
I'm afraid you don't understand, sir. But the truth will become self-evident soon enough.
I laughed in open mockery at his words, deciding that this man must indeed be mad. Whatever, buddy. I'll find my own way from here. Good luck, old-timer. With that, I stepped forward, just as the elevator door slid open. But then I stopped dead in my tracks. Naturally, I expected to walk out into a well-lit lobby, which I could use to access the city street beyond. Instead, and inexplicably, I found myself staring into a darkened forest, which sat directly outside of the elevator's doors. I remember just standing there, totally dumbstruck for what seemed like an eternity. I thought this was either a trick, or I was suffering from a hallucination. What drugs had I taken last night? This was some trippy shit. But I'd taken psychedelic drugs before, and never experienced anything like this. It was all so real, right down to the cold night breeze and smell of pine cones. This was an actual forest, with rows of tall trees, as far as the eye could see. What the actual hell? I muttered, as my exhausted brain tried to make sense of this inexplicable situation.
Level 1.
The attendant repeated.
Otherwise known as limbo, the entrance to the underworld, and home to unfortunate souls trapped between heaven and hell.
What are you saying? I demanded, as the panic rose from the pit of my stomach. What have you done to me?
I've done nothing to you, sir,
he replied without emotion.
Your decisions, the life you have led, this is what has brought you to this place. I am not here to harm you, merely to guide you through the levels, in the hope you will eventually make it home.
I shook my head in dismay, not wanting to listen to these crazy words. When I looked out into the woods, I was hit by a terrible foreboding, a cold chill of terror, as I anticipated the horrors that lay before me. But there was seemingly nowhere else for me to go, and so I set forward, cautiously walking out onto the cold black soil of the forest floor. I noted the attendant following after me, keeping a respectable distance, although I could feel his piercing glare on the back of my neck. The forest was unlike any I'd ever encountered before. Woods at night can often evoke a primal fear in the human psyche. But there was something very unnatural about this inexplicable forest which I now walked through. As I slowly progressed under the shadowy trees, I heard a faint sound carried through the cold night air, gradually growing louder the farther I walked. I listened intently to make out the voices, the faint but pained cries of 1,000 souls calling out at once. Some of the languages I recognized, others I didn't. But there was one common denominator. All were crying out, in pain and fear. My whole body shivered as I heard those wretched people cry, but yet I could not see them or identify where the sound was originating from.
These poor souls,
the attendant stated sympathetically.
In truth, they did little wrong during their mortal lives, but are trapped here by circumstances. In time, some of them will ascend to a better place, but alas, there's nothing we can do to help.
I was only half listening to my guide's explanation, but his words did evoke a memory in the back of my mind, something I'd read or heard of many years previously. My mind was racing in that moment as I tried to come to terms with my hellish situation. How could this be happening? Was I dead? I had never believed in the supernatural or thought there was an afterlife. Surely, there must be some kind of rational explanation. In any case, my objective was to escape and make my way home, and so I ignored the pained cries and walked on. Before long, I stumbled upon what I thought was my way out, I reached the bottom of a steep hill and looked up, seeing a bright light shining on top of the mount. I can't explain why, but I was drawn towards the light, somehow knowing it represented my salvation. I put a confident foot forward and began my ascent up the hillside. But in that moment, I felt a firm hand on my shoulder. I turned to see the attendant holding me back, a stern look on his face as he spoke.
"You can't go that way. Trust me, sir."
"Screw off," I shot back angrily, pulling myself free from his cold grasp as I marched forward with determination. But, of course, I didn't get far. I'd taken less than a dozen steps up the hillside before I froze, as my primal instincts kicked in. I heard a sinister rustling in the bushes ahead and looked up in time to see a creature emerge from the shadows, the dark shape of a predator with hungry eyes. A moment later, another emerged, and then another. To my horror, I witnessed a pack of savage and unnatural wolves emerge on the hillside, their eyes burning with hatred and fangs dripping with blood as they focused upon me. Their prey. As one, the pack let out a bloodthirsty howl, and a moment later they were charging, tearing down the hillside, and heading straight for me. I screamed in terror and rapidly retreated, but in my panicked state, I tripped and fell down into the dirt. Suddenly, I was set upon by the alpha, raising my right arm in a desperate attempt to defend myself. I squealed in agony as the beast bit down, its razor-sharp fangs plunging into my exposed flesh and bone. I looked into the wolf's frenzied eyes and was sure it would rip me to shreds, but the attendant came to my rescue, kicking the hellhound back and dragging me away from the kill zone and off the hillside. The alpha had been stunned, but not seriously wounded, and the rest of the pack were hot on his heels. I braced myself for a fresh attack, but the pack stopped dead in their tracks at the bottom of the hillside, snarling and pacing but not attacking. It was like there was an invisible line on the ground which they could not cross. I was astonished by this sudden turn of events, but this wasn't all. When I looked down at my arm, expecting to see a nasty wound where I'd been bitten, there was nothing. My skin was unblemished, and I felt no pain. I looked to the attendant, my savior, for an explanation.
"They can't leave the hillside, but they will protect their territory with all the force in hell. We cannot pass."
I didn't want to believe it. The light on the top of the hill seemed so close and inviting. "Surely, there must be a way," I pleaded.
"No,"
he replied with certainty.
"The beast will not leave this path until the end of time. I told you this journey would not be easy. Alas, there are no shortcuts through the hellscapes."
I got to my feet with some difficulty, casting a last glance at the bloodthirsty pack before moving on. I couldn't avoid the obvious any longer. The terrible truth was staring me right in the face. "I'm dead, aren't I?" I whimpered. I'm dead and this is hell." The attendant nodded his head thoughtfully, as if he'd been anticipating this question.
"You are in hell, but you are not dead. Not yet, at least. In fact, you have been given a remarkable opportunity, the chance to walk the levels of hell and learn the truth of the afterlife. Why, I cannot say. As I've already explained, I am merely your guide and will do my utmost to keep you alive. But sir, I must insist that you obey my instructions. You were lucky to survive that last encounter, and I can't protect you from all the threats to come."
I nodded my head vigorously, suddenly realizing that this odd man was my only friend in this hell, and he represented my last chance at salvation. Suddenly, something clicked in my confused brain, an old memory brought to life. I know this story. The Inferno. The circles of hell.
Yes,
the attendant confirmed.
Dante's work, written during the 14th century AD. He made the same journey as you will all those centuries ago, but what you see and experience will be unique to your own mortal existence. Even I do not know what lies ahead.
I shuddered, hating the uncertainty and the unenviable situation I'd been placed in. Why me was the question I asked. It made no logical sense, but throughout my life, I had adapted to my often dire circumstances and survived against the odds, and I certainly wasn't going to give up now. In that moment, I decided that I would do whatever it took and would face whatever horrors lay ahead. Okay then, lead on, my friend. The attendant nodded dispassionately before striding back into the forest, and I followed, placing my life in this stranger's hands. We walked for what seemed like an eternity through the darkness and under the canopies. My feet ached, and I was chilled all the way through. In time, the growls of the wolf pack and disembodied cries of the dead faded away to nothing. But I still felt incredibly uneasy, having the distinct impression that we were being watched, that a sinister and unnatural entity was tracking our every move. I definitely had the feeling that we weren't welcome here, or at least, I wasn't. This wasn't my world, and I didn't belong here. We barely spoke during that long march through the dark woods. I asked questions of my guide, but received few answers. Who are you? Are you alive? And why are you helping me? I inquired.
I am no one,
was his cryptic response.
The name I had during my mortal existence is no longer relevant. And yes, I am dead. But I find myself in the unique position where I can pass between the levels without interference. And this allows me to act as the guide to individuals such as yourself.
I was almost ready to quit when I heard a new sound. The soft sobbing of a child. A cold chill ran through me as I experienced a chilling déjà vu, a memory of a past trauma, which I'd long since tried to bury. We walked into a clearing, and I saw the sobbing figure was a little girl. Maybe 8 or 9, her long dark hair covering her tear-filled face. My heart beat fast in my chest as I approached her, reaching out to gently brush back her hair and look into her eyes. I gasped in shock and recoiled whenever I saw the face staring back at me. It was my little sister, Sarah, the girl who died 36 years ago in the most tragic of circumstances. I guess this is a good opportunity to explain something about my family history. It'd be fair to say I didn't have the easiest start in life. My parents were neglectful and abusive, but I'll talk more about them later. My older brother was no good either, and so I had to look after myself from a young age. Honestly, I was okay with that. But then there was Sarah, my little sister. For some reason, she looked up to me, and I felt responsible for her. No one else was going to look after her after all, but I was a dumb teenager doing stupid shit out on the streets. The night Sarah died is one I've tried hard to forget. I had been out all night, and I guess my sister got worried because she left the house and walked the streets looking for me. She got struck by a hit-and-run driver and died on the curbside, alone and afraid. I couldn't forgive myself for my sister's death. If only I'd stayed home that night, she would have lived. I guess it's a big part of the reason why I got so screwed up during my teens. But time moved on, and I learned to live with the trauma, or at least, how to dull the pain with drink and drugs. But of course, I never expected to see my sister again, and I wasn't prepared for this. To encounter Sarah still in her 9-year-old body and forever trapped in a cycle of pain and fear. This was worse than anything I could have imagined. She looked up at me with bloody tears in her eyes, a crimson red dripping down her pale cheeks. And when her pure blood fell, it was fed upon by worms and insects, which crawled across the forest floor. Instinctively, I overcame my fear and reached out to grab her, to hold my sister and never let her go. But when I took Sarah in my arms, her body literally fell apart, dissolving into ash in my hands. I looked down in horror as her remains blew away in the wind, and even then, I could still hear her soft sobbing, a lasting reminder of my failure to save her soul. I cried out, holding my head in my hands in utter despair as the grief overcame me. Glancing up, I saw the attendant standing over me, quietly observing my pain. "Why?" I demanded. "Why are you doing this to her? I get it, man. I'm a piece of shit and deserve everything I get. But Sarah, she's an innocent. She never did anything to anybody. Why punish her? That isn't fair."
"Fair?"
the attendant replied thoughtfully.
"You must know that life isn't fair. So why would you think death would be any different? As for your sister, she is not being punished as such. She is simply lost. In time, she may find her way to a better place. But for now, there is nothing you or I can do to help her, alas."
I shook my head in disbelief. "So why show me her suffering like this? Why torture me?"
"It is not my role to torture you, nor do I determine what you shall see on each level. This is your journey. I am merely the guide."
It seemed this was his answer to every question, and perhaps it was the truth. I didn't know why I'd been put in this unenviable position, but guessed I would face many more horrors before the end. We soon left the clearing as I muttered a final goodbye to Sarah, begging her forgiveness for my failings. We didn't walk for long until we reached the exit, a second elevator, inexplicably standing in the middle of the forest, illuminated by artificial light and with the doors already open. The attendant held out his arm, motioning for me to enter.
"Time to move on,"
he said. "Yeah," I replied, with a grim resignation, as I stepped inside and the door slammed shut. We descended for a long time before the elevator came to a stop. I had much to think about after my ghostly encounter with my dead sister, but what really scared me was the thought of what lay ahead. As my nameless guide had said, limbo was the first level or circle, and not even hell proper, so it seemed my situation would only get worse as I descended. When I questioned the attendant, I predictably received the bare minimum of information, merely being told that we must pass through each and every level before I could go home. I pondered this as the lift halted and the door pinged.
"Level 2. Lust. Brace yourself,"
the attendant warned. I planned to ask him what he meant, but as soon as the door opened, I was hit by a blast of cold wind, which nearly knocked me off of my feet. Looking ahead, I saw a seemingly endless, desolate plain, stretching for as far as the eye could see, a wasteland set underneath a pale sun. But worst of all was the gale which swept across the land, a heavy wind, which made it difficult to stand, let alone walk. Even the attendant needed to shout to be heard over the mighty gale.
"Take my arm. I shall assist you."
I did as instructed, and we slowly marched forward into the windswept wasteland, struggling with each and every step. I looked to the horizon and wondered how we would ever advance through this hellish level. But it got worse. As we staggered ahead, suddenly the ground in front of us shook and cracked open, and from beneath the rocky surface emerged a monstrous figure, a giant, easily 20 feet tall, taking the shape of a man, but with a grotesque, snake-like tail wrapped around his body. The giant stood up, blocking our path with his huge frame and making the earth quake under his heavy feet. He looked down upon us with piercing eyes as his snake tail uncoiled. I was sure this monster would attack us at any moment, and so be made ready to flee. But my guide held me steady, shouting in my ear,
"Behold Minos, the judge and gatekeeper of the underworld. None may pass without his permission."
I stood frozen to the spot, fearing what this monster would do to me. I could feel the judgment in his piercing glare, and it chilled me to the bone. I watched helplessly as he opened his gaping mouth and spoke in a booming, inhuman voice.
"It is not your time. You should not be here,"
he proclaimed. I was left speechless, but thankfully my guide had an answer already prepared.
"We are on a mission from God,"
he replied confidently.
"I must insist that you let us through."
I could hardly believe how the attendant dared to speak to this monster, and thought Minos would either laugh in open mockery or crush us both with his bare hands. But, to my immense surprise, he did neither, instead exclaiming the words,
"And so it shall be."
With that, Minos retreated back into the hole from which he'd emerged. But, before his head disappeared beneath the ground, he offered parting words that I soon realized were directed towards me.
"Until we meet again."
As soon as the giant left, the gale returned. I don't think I could have withstood the mighty wind if it hadn't been for my guide, who somehow stood tall, in spite of the sheer force hitting us. We slowly moved forward across the windswept plain, and in time I saw others trapped in their own struggles, emaciated and half-naked souls, trying in vain to stand and walk before the gale knocked them down to the hard rocky ground. There must have been thousands of them, all stuck in the same cruel loop.
"They have no respite,"
the attendant explained.
"The wind is relentless and the suffering never-ending."
I felt a lump in my throat as I considered the implications of what I'd been told. This was eternity for these people, to never have shelter or peace, and to forever fall victim to the vicious winds of level 2. I wondered what one would have needed to do in their life to end up in this place. I soon got my answer, in a manner of speaking. I almost stumbled over the man in front of me, a wretched figure who'd curled up in the fetal position in a vain attempt to protect himself from the wind. He looked up, and I met his eye, once again reacting with shock as I recognized the tormented soul. It was my father, who'd died 27 years previously. And to be fair, he looked as surprised to see me as I did him, his face screwed up in confusion before there was a spark of recognition in his bloodshot eyes. "Son, is that really you? Thank God, you gotta help me." I snarled upon hearing this plea, feeling nothing but resentment and anger, Continuing with the theme of my fucked up family, you'll not be surprised to learn that my father wasn't a good role model. In fact, he spent several years beating my mother, drinking up what little money we had, and screwing anything with a pulse, before he eventually abandoned his family altogether. I was 12 years old when he left, and I never did see him again, but I heard how he'd continued his abusive and manipulative behavior until eventually one of his girlfriends had enough of being used as a human punch bag and unloaded a shotgun into his belly. I didn't even attend his funeral, and certainly had never imagined I would ever encounter my father again. But this night had been full of surprises. He held up his hand, looking for support against the gale, but I slapped it away. "You want my help? Seriously?" I spat back angrily. "Why the hell should I do anything for you? The way I see it, you're right where you belong. Lust. That was your vice, right? Forever chasing tail? Treating women like dirt? Hey," he responded defensively, whilst using the last of his strength to stand up against the high wind. I was shocked by how pathetic he now looked. No longer was he the imposing and intimidating man I remembered from my youth. This figure was a mere shadow of his former self, a result of his many years of torment. I couldn't feel sorry for him, though. My heart was turned to stone. "Hey," he continued meekly, "your mother was no angel, don't forget that." I couldn't argue with him on that point, but it was no excuse. "You left us and never came back. Sarah died, you know. Do you even care?" He lowered his head, seemingly in shame, but he soon recovered to deliver a lame justification. "Look, I'm sorry, okay? What do you want from me? I was a shitty father and an asshole, but I don't deserve this. Look, you gotta get me out of here." I shook my head and started to walk away, breaking eye contact with the pathetic old man. "There's nothing I can do for you." I nodded to the attendant and indicated that I was ready to move on. But as we fought against the wind, I was distracted by a cry from the rear as my father offered a final insult. "You son of a bitch, you think you're better than me? I always knew there was something wrong with your boy. You were a bad one from the day we brought you home. And where the hell were you when your sister died? You were her big brother, and she trusted you." As you can imagine, his accusations touched a nerve, and in that moment I saw red, ignoring the attendant in the foul weather as I charged towards my father, carrying a hatred in my heart as I reached out to throttle him. But as soon as my hands touched his throat, my father's body disintegrated into ash, and his remains were scattered by the winds. My momentum carried me forwards, and I fell heavily down onto the rocks head first. A sharp pain reverberated through my skull, and I lost consciousness, my whole world going black. I don't know how long I was out for, but my next memory was being physically dragged across the windswept plain by my guide. He really was determined to get me through this hellscape, for whatever reason. I was looking upwards into the sky above, which I noted had turned a sinister shade of blood red. My head was throbbing as I stared into that abyss, and yet I remember what I saw as clear as day. I could only look on in impotent horror as a horrifying entity emerged from the clouds, a hideous, demonic face adorned with horns and eyes so red and piercing I could feel them penetrating my very soul. The demon, or whatever it was huge, soon dominating the entire skyline. There was an animalistic look to the beast, but also a cruel cunning and intelligence behind his glowing eyes. It opened its gaping maw and exposed rows of crocodile-like teeth, and then it laughed, emitting a cruel, sadistic cackle which drowned out every other sound. I could tell the demon's hatred was focused upon me, its predator-like gaze cutting through me. I imagined the beast sweeping me up and devouring me whole within its mighty jaws. My loyal guide had protected me thus far, but I doubted whether he had any power over this beast. As if to prove my point, the attendant dragged me along at a faster pace, fighting against the gale and pulling my considerable weight across the rocks. I wanted to get up and run but couldn't. The horrific din of the demon's foul cackle filled my ears. It was so loud in my head that I feared it would explode. And before long, I drifted out of consciousness, and the darkness took me once again. The next time I awoke, I found myself in the relative safety of the elevator. Somehow, the attendant had got me back here in one piece, and he was now looking over me dispassionately, offering no sympathy or explanation. I staggered up to my feet and held my hand up to my forehead, discovering that my wound had miraculously healed itself. I addressed my savior and asked him the question which was foremost on my mind. What was that thing, the monster in the sky? I noted the grim look etched upon the attendant's face, and for the first time, I swore I could see fear in his normally emotionless eyes.
I think you know who that is,
he answered grimly.
He has been following our progress through his domain, and will continue to do so. We have a long journey still ahead of us, and will face many challenges and perils.
He wasn't kidding. My stomach churned as I remembered Dante's work, recalling that there were 9 circles in his description of hell. So far, we'd been through 2. This meant 7 more levels, with their severity increasing the lower we got. And in addition to the hellscapes we would cross, it was clear that I would be confronted by many more ghosts from my past, and undoubtedly I would need to face my own demons along the way. And then there was the beast, who I believed was Satan himself. The devil was watching my every step, and it seemed that my guide was powerless against him. I could only guess his intentions towards me, but I reckoned the Lord of Darkness didn't wish me good fortune. All these terrors were in my mind as I glanced into the attendant's dark eyes, and my heart sunk when I heard the ominous ping as our lift reached the next level. And so, my torturous tale continues. When I last left you, I was still in the early stages of my unplanned and certainly unwanted journey through hell, a latter-day repeat of Dante's Inferno. Why was I chosen for this odyssey into the underworld? I couldn't say, and my enigmatic guide, taking the form of an elderly elevator attendant, was unable to tell me. And technically, I wasn't dead, but it was clear I could suffer during my travels, and the monsters I encountered would certainly harm me, both physically and mentally. What's more, this hell was very personal to me, as I was confronted by a literal ghost from my past, dragging up old traumas, which I'd tried my hardest to bury deep in my subconscious. First my sister, and then my father. Gut-wrenching experiences that shook me to my very core. This was levels 1 and 2 of hell, and I still had 7 to go. And if this wasn't bad enough, the devil was aware of my presence in his kingdom and watching my every move. These fears were foremost in my mind as the elevator hit the 3rd level, emitting an ominous ping before the doors slid open.
Level 3, Gluttony,
my guide announced.
I would advise you to watch your step.
When the lift doors were fully ajar, I found myself looking out on yet another wasteland, stretching as far as I could see, except While level 2 was a rocky, windswept plain, level 3 was an endless field of wet mud under a seemingly permanent cloud front emitting cold, icy rain. I sighed in miserable resignation, as I soon realized we would need to cross yet another grim hellscape to reach the next level. The attendant led the way, motioning for me to follow. The freezing cold rain hit me as I soon walked out, and my feet sunk into the mud. Every step was a struggle as we trudged forwards, but before long, the true horrors of level 3 were revealed. I looked to the horizon and saw the beast emerge through the heavy wall of rain, a huge monstrosity tearing towards us. I started to back off instinctively, although noted how the attendant stood tall and did not retreat. As the monster rapidly approached, I made out its hideous shape for the first time. The creature was a black dog as big as a horse, but instead of having one head, it had 3. A trio of snarling maws full of dagger-like teeth and 6 eyes filled with hunger and hatred. The monster barked aggressively as it charged, the sound amplified by its 3 mouths. I didn't share my guide's courage, and so attempted to flee, but my feet became bogged down in the mud, and so I didn't get far. I turned back around in impotent terror as the beast closed the gap, its howls growing louder and its 3 maws salivating as it closed in for the kill. But the attendant didn't budge from the spot, instead reaching into his jacket pocket and inexplicably withdrawing 3 slabs of raw meat, flinging them into the beast's path. To my astonishment, the trick worked, as the hellhound ceased its charge, and the 3 hungry mouths grabbed at the meat, devouring their meal in quick order. Nevertheless, I thought it would only delay the beast temporarily before it renewed its attack upon us. But once again, I was wrong. Once the beast had finished its meal, it cast us a parting glare through its 6 eyes before casually retreating back into the rain-swept hellscape. I stayed down in the mud until my guide walked over me, offering me a hand and pulling me up.
Cerberus, the Hound of Hades. He guards this level and torments its inhabitants. My offerings will keep the beast at bay for a time, but it is not safe here, and we must move on.
No shit, I swore. I knew I should be grateful to my guide. After all, he'd already saved my ass on several occasions, and hopefully would continue to do so. But by now, I was thoroughly pissed off. Clearly, the attendant had at least some idea of what we'd face on each level, and he should be keeping me informed of the threats we faced. I threw my head up when he ordered me to continue through the mud and rain to an unknown destination. "This is bullshit, man. Just look at this shithole," I exclaimed angrily. I pointed to the endless wasteland of wet mud, noting the wretched figures slowly sinking into it, utterly defeated as the grim misery of this hellscape weighed them down. "We can't cross this. I can't go on." The attendant looked upon me with curiosity rather than frustration, and in an instant, he offered a solution of sorts.
You must cross this level or stay here for all eternity. But hell can take many different forms, and this environment is only one. Would you rather take a different path?
I nodded my head enthusiastically and answered, "Yeah, of course I would."
Very well,
he answered, as the rain continued to beat down.
It shall be done, but I have already warned you, sir. There is no easy routes through hell, and this alternate path will be just as challenging, in its own way.
"Fine," I replied without thinking. I should have considered his warning more carefully, but right then, I just wanted to get away from the damned mud and rain. What happened next defied logic, but then so had everything which had occurred thus far. All the attendant did was click his fingers, This was followed by a sudden burst of light, which temporarily blinded me, and a moment later, we were miraculously transported to another place. I adjusted my eyes to my new surroundings and was astonished to find myself in what looked like the inside of a saloon bar. A real spit and sawdust establishment with wooden fittings and a stench of whiskey, piss, and vomit. It really was like something out of an old western. I walked across the sticky wood floor in astonishment as I took in the bar and its patrons. It soon became obvious that there was something very wrong with this bar room. When I looked upon the tables, I realized there was no joviality in this place, only misery and overindulgence. At one table, I saw what looked like a family, consisting of a middle-aged mother and father and 2 teenage boys. I noted how the table they sat at was filled to the brim with fast food, cheeseburgers, fried chicken, pizzas, tacos, and more. I watched in disgust as a family stuffed the greasy food into their mouths. They ate and ate, never stopping even to take a breath. And from what I could tell, none of them were even taking any pleasure from their feast, merely piling food down their throats like it was some kind of mandatory task. I came to the conclusion that this was the whole point of the enterprise. These damned souls weren't eating because they were hungry. They were being forced to feed by some unseen power. Their bellies could never be full, and their hunger never satisfied. I could only watch for so long before my stomach turned. At the next table, I saw a group of grizzled men wearing outfits from different periods of history, including a Roman dignitary dressed in a traditional toga, a cowboy in jeans and boots, and an 80s dude with a mullet and shell suit. They were playing cards and drowning shots of whiskey. Once again, there was no pleasure in their game or drinking, only grim faces and dead eyes. The men could have been robots, merely carrying out automated tasks which brought them no satisfaction. This depressing scenario was played out at every table and stool within the bar, as hundreds of tortured souls lived out their own individual nightmares, all victims of the vices and addictions they'd had in life.
Gluttony,
confirmed the attendant, as he followed closely behind me.
Whether they sink into the mud or are dragged down by their vices, in the end, it makes little difference.
I nodded my head, but made no comment. I was too busy thinking about my own gluttonous habits. Drink, drugs, sex. Was I any better than these folks? Honestly, I didn't think so. Care for a drink, squire? I turned around in surprise to see the figure standing behind the bar, apparently waiting to serve me. There was something extremely unnerving about the barkeeper, a barely concealed malice in his dark eyes, and a wide grin which was anything but sincere. The attendant touched me firmly on the shoulder. I turned and saw fear in the man's eyes, and his voice quivered as he spoke.
Don't engage with him. Don't even go near him,
he whispered. I had never seen my guide so scared before, and therefore took his warning very seriously. But I didn't want to risk the twisted barkeep's wrath, and so I answered politely, saying, "No thank you." The barman's grin didn't falter, although I noted a glint of anger behind his eyes as he spoke. "Suit yourself, buddy." We slowly backed away from the bar and pushed past the tables of suffering souls. The attendant was right. This hell was no better than the mud and rain on the outside. I wanted to leave this level, but it wasn't done with me yet. I found her crouched in a dark corner, hiding from the world as she fed her addiction. I looked over her emaciated, half-naked body and was horrified to see needles sticking out from almost every vein. She slowly raised her head, brushing back her straggly hair. The recognition was instantaneous whenever I glanced into her bloodshot eyes. It was my mother, the woman who'd brought me into this world, but who'd been dead for 18 years. And so, I must return to my tragic family history and unveil the next chapter of my screwed-up life. I don't know when my mother first developed her substance abuse problem, but I can't remember her ever being sober. Vodka was her tipple of choice when I was a kid. In a way, I can't blame her for the drinking. My father treated her so badly that I guess she needed something to dull the pain. Still, in truth, she was a nasty drunk prone to violent outbursts. I'd hoped things would improve after my father left, but Mom took the breakup hard. Her drinking got worse, and she started taking hard drugs. The final straw was when Sarah died. That's when my mom got hooked on heroin, and there was no way back for her after that. I'm not gonna claim I was a dutiful son, but I did check in on her occasionally and gave her money when I had it, even though I knew she'd spend it on a fix. It was me who found her, overdosed and lying in a pool of her own bodily fluids. A dirty needle still protruding from a vein in her arm. The memory of my mother's emaciated corpse was yet another traumatic image I tried hard to forget. But it was no surprise that I had to face her here, as my journey through the hell of past nightmares continued unabated. I couldn't help but feel sorry for her as I looked into my mother's pained eyes, although I was horrified by her physical condition. At first, she didn't seem to recognize me as her son, as she muttered incoherently whilst jamming yet another needle into her thigh. "It doesn't matter how many times I fix it, nothing takes my pain away. I just want to die. But I can't. I don't OD, no matter how many needles I stick in me." Her words shook my very soul. Did my mother realize she was already dead? I dreaded having to be the one to tell her. I stuttered, struggling to speak my words through quaking lips. "Don't you remember me? I'm your son." I saw the sudden change in her bloodshot eyes, the slightest of sparks, as she opened her mouth to visibly gasp, revealing yellow and rotten teeth as she did so. My boy, my baby boy," she exclaimed in astonishment. "You've come for me after all this time. I always knew you'd come back." My heart sank as I lost control of my emotions, and tears began rolling down my cheeks. Abandoning my abuse of an absent father hadn't been very hard, but this was different. For all her faults, this woman was still my mom, and I didn't want to see her suffer like this. There was something else, too, a lingering guilt about her death. True, I hadn't forced her to take drugs, but I had enabled her addiction and done nothing to help. The image of her decomposing body was etched in my memory, but now she was here. Not alive exactly, but conscious and in pain. Was this my second chance? "Take me away from here, son," she pleaded. "I want to get clean. Take me home and we can be a family again." I shook my head and broke eye contact. This was too much. Suddenly, I remembered the attendant, turning to face him and delivering a heartfelt but desperate plea. "Surely there must be something we can do. We can't just leave her like this." He nodded his head and opened his mouth to speak, but I never got an answer, because in that moment, all hell broke loose. We heard an immense crashing sound and turned around in time to see the far wall collapsing under a huge impact. There was a terror-filled moment as we all stood dumbstruck, waiting for the dust to settle. And then we saw it. Cerberus, the three-headed hellhound. The beast was hungry, and this was his all-you-can-eat buffet. There followed the briefest of pauses, Before the ballroom descended into bloody pandemonium, the gluttonous patrons suddenly came to life, screaming and overturning tables as they desperately tried to flee, but there was nowhere to hide. The hound hit the obese family first, using all 3 mouths to tear into their flesh, creating a horrific display of chaos and viscera. I could only watch in abject horror as hungry jaws ripped bodies apart, flinging limbs and intestines in all directions as the floor was covered in blood. The massacre of the family was sickening, but thankfully didn't last long. Soon, Cerberus was done with them, raising its 3 heads, their jaws still dripping with fresh blood as they searched for new prey. By now, the bar had descended into total chaos, as screaming and terrified patrons searched in vain for an escape. Cerberus moved fast, hitting sinner after sinner, ripping them to shreds, and feasting on their flesh before moving on to its next victim. The beast was like a bull in a china shop, and no one could resist its bloody wrath. I looked down on my mother and saw the sheer terror in her eyes. Instinctively, I reached out to grab her by the hand as I planned to pull her up onto her feet, but as soon as I touched her cold skin, my mother's frail body fell to pieces, her ashes scattering all over the floor. I shed a tear, but almost felt relieved. By now, Cerberus had finished its killing spree, leaving bloody carnage and viscera in its wake. The beast slowly walked towards us, its stance now more curious than aggressive. The attendant bravely stepped in front of the beast, raising his right hand and speaking in an assertive, booming voice.
"You have had your feast. Now go!"
And to my astonishment, Cerberus obeyed my guide's order, slowly retreating across the blood-splattered floor and heading back towards the hole in the wall. I don't know how he'd done it, but once again, the attendant had saved my skin.
"We should leave. Now,"
he instructed, whilst pointing to an elevator door which had suddenly appeared on the far side of the bar. I didn't need to be told twice, but our time in level 3 was not quite done. A shout from behind forced us both to turn our heads, and the voice was a familiar one. "You think you're special, don't you? You have your little hall pass and think it'll keep you safe." It was the barkeeper, who was the only one still in one piece after the massacre. But this was no man. That much was very now clear. I saw how his eyes burned a demonic red, and his teeth were replaced by predatory fangs. Suddenly, I now knew who was addressing us.
"You know who I serve, who protects us,"
the attendant answered, although I could sense uncertainty in his voice. "Yes, I know who your master is, but this is my realm, and the deeper you delve, the more powerful I become. We shall see how far my enemy's protection will take you both. It will be interesting. Begone now, vile trespassers, until we meet again." The warning chilled me, and I looked to my guide for reassurance, but he appeared uncertain and didn't respond, instead retreating and walking briskly towards the waiting lift. I quickly followed, not wishing to stay in this circle for a moment longer. But just before the elevator door closed, I saw how the bar room had reverted back to its previous appearance, with the gluttonous patrons now restored in body, if not soul, back at their tables, indulging in their individual vices. And there in the corner was my mother, inserting a needle into her arm, whilst muttering incoherently to herself. I understood then that this scene would be played out forever, and as soon as we left, Cerberus would launch another attack. As the doors closed, I could hear the devil's hateful laughter as we descended to the next level. The fourth circle of hell was initially less imposing than the previous two. When I stepped out of the elevator, I thankfully wasn't hit by extremes of weather, only by a darkness and a cold chill, which I believe was more due to the atmosphere than the temperature. As always, I obediently followed the attendant as he led me down a dirt path illuminated by burning torches on each side. I felt uncomfortable as we walked past the fire. I don't know whether it was paranoia, but I was sure there was something in the flames. When I stared into the fire, I swore I could see eyes staring back at me. He was watching us. Always. I remembered the devil's words and realized he was waiting for his opportunity to strike. This was the worst thing about hell, in my opinion. The danger increases the farther you descended, but apparently, we could only go forwards, not backwards. We walked for some time along the torch-lit pathway before reaching a steep hillside, and then I began to understand what this level was about. I saw men and women lined up at the bottom of the hill, all looking downtrodden and defeated, both physically and mentally. The damned were split into 3 lines, all waiting for their turn to climb. At the bottom of the hill was a pile of massive rocks, and each victim needed to carry this weight while they ascended the hillside. Their progress was slow and painful, but this wasn't all. An overseer was present at the start of the line, a huge brute with bulging muscles, his face scarred, and eyes full of pure rage. He wielded a mighty whip, an old-fashioned cat of 9 tails by the look of it. The overseer was very zealous with his whip, thrashing his victims without mercy as he motivated them with abuse and threats.
Come on, you maggots. Move, damn ya. You think you know suffering? I'll show you fucking suffering.
He hit them again and again with the whip, and I winced with every strike. The damned cried out in agony, but offered no resistance, merely continuing their slow climb up the steep gradient whilst carrying their heavy boulders.
Level 4 is greed,
my guide diligently explained.
The weight they carry is punishment for the material possessions they craved and accumulated during their mortal lives.
I nodded my head, but didn't respond. It struck me, not for the first time, that the punishment seemed well out of proportion to the sins committed. This was hell, I suppose, but I'd done some really bad shit in my life, and so dreaded what fate was awaiting me. I didn't want to witness this violence, but my guide took me close to the lines, until my ears were filled with the lashes from the whip and pain cries of the damned. I wondered why he was subjecting me to this horror, but of course I should have known, for when we reached the bottom of the hillside, I saw a familiar face. My brother, deceased for over 15 years. Time for another trip down memory lane and to delve into my always tragic family history. I was the middle child, between my little sister Sarah and my older brother Chris. He was 5 years my senior, and to be honest, a total shithead. My early memories of Chris were as a bully, very much cut from my father's cloth. He picked on me and Sarah, and I'd fight with him frequently to defend my little sister. Chris left home before Sarah died and Mom got hooked on heroin, but I'd reconnected with him later in life. Why, you might ask? Well, he was still my brother, my flesh and blood, but there was a selfish reason, too. I was turning bad, getting myself involved in petty crime, shoplifting, pickpocketing, and the like. I was small time but ambitious, wanting to break through to the big leagues. Back then I looked up to my big brother, if only because I didn't know any better. In my naive and impressionable young mind, I saw him driving fast cars, dating hot women, and living the high life. And I wanted that lifestyle. I knew Chris had connections with the criminal underworld, and his wealth wasn't made honestly. I thought it was my way in. I later learned that my brother was nothing more than a petty con man who lived well beyond his means, owing money all over town. His addiction to the high life was only going to end one way, and in the end, his love of sports cars was the death of him. One night he drove his Ferrari off the side of a bridge and drowned in ice-cold water. Greed had been his vice, so it was no surprise that he'd ended up here. My brother was in a sorry state, slumped over, his back covered in scars from the whippings. The confidence and bravado he had when he was alive was gone, and it was sad to see. A once proud man, reduced to a broken wreck, his eyes sullen and full of pain and fear. I thought he would be shocked to see me, that he would plead for my help like the others, but that wasn't Chris. He looked me over and smiled for what I imagined was the first time in years, and greeted me in a manner that was nearly friendly. "What's up, little bro? Long time no see. I guess they sent you to this shithole too." He laughed, but it didn't sound sincere. "Well, not exactly," I answered awkwardly. "How are you, brother?" He snickered again, although this time the pain in his voice was clear. "Oh, yeah, man. I'm having the time of my life. What can you do, eh?" "It is what it is." He paused for a moment, looking thoughtful. "Man, I miss the old days, though. Remember the good times we had, man? We made a good team, didn't we? Brothers in arms." In truth, I had a few good memories of my brother. In life, he'd been an arrogant, selfish bully who'd have done next to nothing to help his family. But when I saw Chris now, I couldn't help but feel sorry for him. To see a once proud man reduced to this. I was still mulling over my answer when the attack took place, as the brutish overseer lashed out his whip, thrashing the defenseless Chris on his bare back. My brother screamed in agony, but was given no mercy, as he was struck again and again until he could no longer stand. I ran to my brother's aid, noting the bloody wounds across his skin. Then I looked up in anger, confronting the attacker. "Leave him alone! What the hell is the matter with you?" I shouted. I soon noticed my outburst wasn't the smartest of ideas, because when I looked up to the whip-wielding brute, I saw his face was filled with rage. The overseer was huge, his muscles bulging as he gripped his whip tighter. I was terrified, but wanted to protect my brother, and so stood between him and his attacker. Once again, it was the attendant who stayed my neck, putting a firm hand on my shoulder and shaking his head in the negative. By now, Chris had somehow gotten up on his feet and had lifted his heavy boulder. He was obviously struggling with the immense weight in his injuries, but no doubt knew from bitter experience that more beatings would follow unless he completed his task. He looked at me with vulnerability in his eyes and spoke his most genuine words yet. "What do you say, brother? Will you help me with my burden for old time's sake?" I instinctively nodded my head in the affirmative, reaching out to take hold of the boulder. Whilst doing so, my hand accidentally touched my brother's cold skin, and the results were predictable, as his broken body suddenly disintegrated into dust, and the rock fell heavily to the ground. I took a deep breath to calm my nerves and tried to collect my thoughts, but my musings were interrupted by a sudden outburst of movement and a sharp, biting pain. I screamed and fell backwards, glancing up in horror as the brutish overseer prepared to strike me again. I closed my eyes and braced myself, but a familiar booming voice called out,
"How dare you! We have protection from the Almighty!"
The overseer laughed in open mockery, but did not strike.
Your protection is waning, old man. My master is always watching. Now be gone, you lowly maggots. Your time in my domain is at an end. In that instant, the torches marking the path up to the hillside burnt ever fiercer, until the flames engulfed everything, burning the lines of the damned in a horrifying inferno. Amazingly, the wretched made no effort to escape the growing fire. It was almost as if being burnt alive was preferable to the endless torment they would soon face otherwise. Chaos ensued as the whole world burned. The attendant grabbed me and shouted in my ear,
"We need to leave."
A second later, we were sprinting up the steep hillside, escaping the inferno and anarchy behind us. My lungs and calves were burning by the time we eventually reached the top. To my immense relief, I saw the elevator there waiting for us. Our escape, if you could call it that. I cast one last look down the burning hillside, watching as the crazed overseer continued to mercilessly whip his victims, even as the flames engulfed them all. I gave a final thought to my brother before jumping into the lift and preparing myself for the next level. My guide stopped me from stepping out of the lift once we reached level 5, and for good reason. There was no solid ground on the other side, only a dark, mist-covered swamp, which stank of something foul. I physically retched when I looked out upon the grim marshland, and wondered how we would ever cross this hellscape. But a moment later, a small boat emerged from behind the fog. A wooden vessel, seemingly piloted by a sinister figure wearing a black robe, which covered his entire body and head. The boat moved slowly towards us. I had no idea how the vessel was being powered, but suppose this wasn't really important.
"This is our ferry across the Styx, and will transport us to the city of Dis,"
the attendant explained.
"Welcome to level 5. Anger."
I didn't want to climb on board this vessel and put my life in the hands of this creepy pilot, but I had to trust my guide's judgment. I watched as the attendant deftly reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a single gold coin, coolly throwing it across the void, where it was caught by the hooded pilot in his bony hand.
"Shall we?"
the attendant asked, motioning me towards the waiting boat. I took a deep breath and climbed on board, closely followed by my guide, and we began our slow journey across the hellish swamp. I couldn't look at our pilot during the uncomfortable journey. I never saw his face or even knew whether he had one, and the pilot never spoke a word. Instead, my attention was drawn towards the dark waters beneath us. We hadn't gone far before the swamp started to bubble, as if it was boiling under extreme heat. I almost had a heart attack when I saw the first figure emerge, his head rising out of the slime as he screamed with absolute rage at the sky above. A moment later, and a second figure popped up, a soul filled with hate who instantly attacked the first man, diving and grabbing him by the throat. The two fought fiercely, tearing strips out of each other until they both sank back underneath the surface. They were only the first of many, however, as more emerged from the depths of the swamp, fighting furiously with each other as the water boiled around them. And to my astonishment and horror, I saw the entire swamp transformed into a chaotic battleground. The water swayed back and forth, and I was sure our little boat would capsize under the waves, but somehow we stayed afloat and kept moving forwards. But the hellish cries, the violence, it was too much. I closed my eyes and covered my ears, but couldn't drown out the sound or forget the horrific scenes. My guide moved closer and whispered in my ear. For once, his tone was sympathetic.
"It will be over soon. Stay strong."
His words brought me some comfort, but our journey across the Styx seemed to last an eternity. I experienced a great relief when our boat finally reached the barren shoreline, leaving the cries of the desperate fighters behind. But any satisfaction I felt disappeared as soon as I set eyes upon the city. We stepped out on the shore and looked up at the wall, which was easily 100 feet high and adorned with warlike turrets which ascended up into the dark skyline. I saw what I can only describe as demons, winged harpies with scaly skin and mouths full of sharp fangs. They glared down upon us with malice, cackling as they flew between the ramparts, closely watching our progress as we moved towards the long bridge which granted access to the huge gate built into the city walls. I made the mistake of looking over the bridge as we crossed, seeing the deep moat below. It was too dark to see much, but I noted the predatory creatures swimming in the foul water, snapping and biting excitedly as they sensed the potential prey walking above them. As if this wasn't bad enough, the harpies chose that moment to swoop down, shrieking like banshees as they flew only inches above our heads, snarling and snapping at us with their claws and fangs. "Holy shit!" I cried in terror as I ducked to avoid the beast's assaults.
"Keep on walking,"
the attendant ordered.
"Don't look up."
I don't know how I kept moving forward, but somehow I summoned the strength. Finally, we reached the end of the bridge and the gate, a huge doorway of thick wood and steel. I was astonished when the attendant confidently approached and banged his fist against the gate, shouting out to someone or something unseen.
"We have been granted permission to enter. I insist that you open this gate."
The harpies that soared above us cackled cruelly, but they didn't carry through with an attack, instead withdrawing and taking up positions on the towers above. A moment later, and the huge gate opened ever so slightly, allowing us access to Dis, the city in the middle of hell. I knew none of this at the time, of course, typically receiving the bare minimum of information from my secretive guide. Nevertheless, I found Dis was predictably grim and soul-crushing, devoid of any beauty or character, and instead made up of brutal military structures and crumbling buildings. As soon as we entered the walls, it started to rain, a heavy deluge descending from the dark skies above, only adding to my misery. I observed the depressing architecture of Dis as we walked through the labyrinth-like streets of Hell's capital. Dis appeared to be abandoned, and I wondered whether it had any residents, dead or otherwise. But then we walked out into a small square and saw a gang of thugs squaring up to fight. There were 4 men in total, 3 against 1 from what I could tell, all preparing for mortal combat in the heavy rain. The 3 attackers were an odd mix. Their tattered uniforms marked them out as soldiers from different periods of history. A Roman legionnaire in full armor, a British redcoat from the American Revolution, and a German infantryman dressed up in a First World War uniform and helmet. All were armed with sharp blades, short swords, and bayonets. The man they were facing off against was very familiar to me. My old friend and criminal associate, Rocky, the toughest son of a bitch I'd ever known. Back in my teens, I ran with a street gang in my neighborhood. Petty stuff mostly. Shoplifting, burglaries, selling weed, shit like that. We frequently fought with other gangs, too. Now, I was handy enough with my fists back in the day, but I was nothing compared to Rocky, which obviously wasn't his real name. This guy could beat the shit out of 6 rivals without drawing a sweat, and he fought with the cops, winning most of the time. Nobody would mess with us when Rocky ran with our crew, but we were frightened of him too. This guy would go from 0 to 100 with a snap of your fingers. He had a foul temper, and you could never tell what would set him off. But when the red mist came over him, you were wise to get the hell out of his way. Eventually, our little gang split up as we went our separate ways. I lost touch with Rocky in the years that followed, but a crazy son of a bitch like him was never going to live to old age. A few years later, I'd heard he'd been shot and killed during a botched armed robbery. I felt bad for my old friend, but quickly moved on. But now here he was, preparing for deadly combat on the rain-soaked streets of Dis. I knew my friend was tough, but didn't think he'd survive an attack by 3 trained soldiers. Therefore, the rapid flurry of violence that followed was astonishing yet sickening. Rocky, armed only with a baseball bat, dodged the first attack by the Legionnaire, avoiding his sword and striking him in the throat with his bat. The Roman reeled on the ground as Rocky quickly grabbed his sword, using it to stab the Legionnaire through the eye. The British and German soldiers both attacked simultaneously, slashing out with their blades as they desperately tried to deliver the killing blow. But Rocky countered their attacks, blocking their blades before he struck back. He stabbed the redcoat in the belly, leaving him thrashing in agony in the mud. Next, he moved on to the German, slicing his head off with a mighty swipe of his sword. Rocky finished by putting the Brit out of his misery, clinically cutting his throat. He exhaled heavily, his eyes wild and face covered in the splattered blood of his victims. It was only then that Rocky noticed my presence, greeting me amicably as he stepped over his freshly produced bodies. "Hey, what's up, old buddy? Fancy meeting you here." I stepped forward under the heavy rain, shocked and confused by what I had just witnessed, but also strangely reassured. Rocky was the first damned soul I'd encountered who was able to fight back against his tormentors, to fight back and win. Perhaps this was a turning point? "That was impressive," I stated, looking down at the 3 dead men. "Yeah," Rocky said proudly. "Shit's crazy down here, but if you know how to fight, you can hold your own. Stick with me, man. We can really clean up in this joint." I smiled for the first time in a long while and seriously considered his offer. Maybe hell was like prison. You just had to join the right gang to survive. But of course, it wasn't that simple. Rocky was still grinning when a horde of zombie-like attackers charged him from behind. I shouted out a warning, but it was too late, as the bloodthirsty mob jumped him. Rocky fought back bravely and taken out several, but he was soon overwhelmed by sheer numbers, as the mob beat him mercilessly before slicing his belly open with daggers. Rocky screamed in agony as they feasted on his flesh and internal organs in a sickening display. I turned away in disgust as my friend's screams died away, the sound being replaced by a sadistic laughter that was sadly all too familiar. I turned around to see a solitary figure standing at an open window, overlooking the blood-splattered square. He'd taken on a new form, but I recognized him at once. It was the devil, still stalking us and observing our progress, taking a perverse pleasure from our setbacks and failures. "The house always wins in hell, sooner or later," he exclaimed, still cackling as he moved away from the window and disappeared into the shadows. I fell to my knees in despair as the rain kept beating down. Predictably, an elevator had appeared in the doorway of a nearby crumbling building, and my ever-present guide was motioning for me to join him inside. But I couldn't. I'd reached my breaking point and refused to get off of my knees. "I won't go any further," I screamed emotionally. "This shit is crazy. Every level is worse than the last. How can I hope to survive this? Enough is enough. I won't play this sick game anymore." The attendant's response surprised me, as it seemed so out of character. I watched in dismay as his face screwed up with anger and he marched towards me, striking out with his right hand and slapping me hard across the face, knocking me down as I cried in pain and shock. Next, he grabbed me by the collar and forced me to look into his intense eyes.
How many times must I tell you?
He screamed angrily.
We cannot go back or stay in one place. We keep moving forward or die. Believe me, what you've seen so far is nothing to the suffering you'll face if you fail this task. I will drag you through these hells even if it destroys us both. Do you understand?
I shook my head vigorously as I looked into the old man's crazed eyes. In that moment, I was more afraid of my long-suffering guide than I was of all the demons and horrors in hell. He pulled me up on my feet and dragged me into the waiting elevator, and I held my head in my hands and wept as the door slammed shut and we descended once again.